In 1513, a man sat alone in a cold room in Florence. He had just been arrested, tortured, stripped of everything he built over 14 years of political power. His enemies expected him to break. They expected him to beg, to explain himself. To fight back, he said nothing. He sat still. He observed. He waited. That man was Niccolò Machiavelli. And in that silence, in that single, deliberate refusal to react, he discovered something that most people never figure out in their entire lives. The person who controls their reaction controls everything. The person who controls their reaction controls everything. Welcome to the Aware Mind. Today, we are going to talk about something that looks simple on the surface, but is one of the most psychologically powerful moves a human being can make. We are going to talk about what happens deep inside the human brain when you simply ignore someone. Not out of weakness, not because you have nothing to say, but because you understand something they don't. Most people believe that power is loud. They believe that the person who speaks the most, argues the hardest, and pushes back the strongest wins. But Carl Jung, one of the most brilliant minds in the history of psychology, said something very different. He said, the most intense conflicts, if overcome, leave behind a sense of security and calm that is not easily disturbed. Read that again slowly. Jung is not saying that conflict is bad. He is saying that the person who has overcome their own emotional reactions, the person who no longer flinches, carries a kind of peace inside them that becomes almost impossible to break from the outside. That peace is not weakness. That peace is a weapon. Ripple effect on still water, something small thrown in. The surface disturbs, then returns to calm. And today, we are breaking down exactly how to use it. 7 psychological mechanisms. 7 ways that silence, deliberate, strategic silence, completely flips the power in any interaction. These are not tips from a self-help book. These are ideas that have been sitting inside the writing of Machiavelli, Jung, Nietzsche, Robert Greene, Epictetus, and others for centuries. Most people walk past them every day without ever noticing. You are not going to walk past them anymore. Before we go into the first mechanism, I need you to understand one thing. This is not about being cold. This is not about being rude or distant or emotionally closed off. This is about one very specific skill, the skill of choosing your response. Because the moment you can choose whether or not to react, you are no longer being controlled by anyone. And if you cannot choose if something someone says or does automatically triggers you, then you are not free. You are being operated like a machine, and someone else is pressing your buttons. Epictetus knew this over 2,000 years ago. He was a slave literally owned by another person, and yet he wrote some of the most powerful words in the history of human psychology. He said, "Men are disturbed not by the things that happen, but by the opinions about the things." Think about what that means. The insult does not hurt you. Your decision to receive it as an insult, that is what hurts you. The provocation has no power. Your automatic reaction to it, that is what transfers the power to someone else. This is where mechanism number 1 begins. Mechanism 1. The mirror shatters here is something no one tells you about human psychology. Every single time a person tries to provoke you, they are doing something very specific. They are holding up an invisible mirror and waiting to see their own reflection in your face. When you react with anger, they see, I matter. I affected this person. When you defend yourself, they see, my words landed. They feel it. When you rush to explain, they see, I have access to their mind. Your reaction is the mirror, and every emotional response you give is proof that their image is being reflected back to them. But here's what happens. The moment you refuse to react, the mirror shatters. Suddenly, there is nothing for them to see. No anger in your eyes. No tension in your voice. No hurried explanation. Just stillness. Just quiet. Just a person who looks like they were never affected at all. And this is where something fascinating begins to happen inside their brain. Carl Jung described the human psyche as deeply dependent on what he called relational feedback, the unconscious signals we receive from other people that confirm our own sense of reality. In simple terms, we look at other people's reactions to know how we are being received. When you remove that feedback, when you give them nothing, their brain starts searching desperately for an explanation. Did they hear me? Did they understand what I said? Why aren't they reacting? Am I less threatening than I thought? Are they stronger than me? Notice what is happening here. You have said nothing. You have done nothing, and yet their mind is already beginning to doubt itself. This is not an accident. This is psychology working exactly the way it was designed to work. Robert Greene, in the 48 Laws of Power, captured this perfectly. He wrote, "Never outshine the master," meaning that the person who appears unaffected, unhurried, and emotionally stable is automatically perceived as the one who holds the room. The mirror break is not about ignoring someone because you dislike them. It is about removing the one signal they were counting on to feel powerful. And without that signal, without your reaction, they are not talking to a person anymore. They are talking to a wall. And walls do not care what you say to them. I want you to drop one word in the comments right now. Just one word that describes how you feel when someone tries to provoke you and you manage to stay completely calm. One word. Drop it below. Stay with me because mechanism 2 is where things get even more interesting. Let me tell you about a man named Abraham Lincoln. In 1858, Lincoln was in the middle of one of the most watched political debates in American history. His opponent, Stephen Douglas, was aggressive, loud, confident. Douglas used every tool available to make Lincoln look weak, unprepared, and unworthy of serious attention. And Lincoln, this tall, quiet man from Illinois, did something that confused everyone in the room. He smiled. Not a nervous smile. Not a fake smile. A calm, unhurried, no something you Dan. He let Douglas finish. He let the applause die. And then, slowly, without raising his voice even slightly, he began to speak. And the moment Lincoln opened his mouth, the entire room felt it. The energy had shifted. Douglas had been talking at Lincoln, and Lincoln had simply not been there to receive it. He had refused to occupy the emotional space Douglas was trying to push him into. That refusal, that quiet, deliberate refusal, is exactly what Mechanism 2 is built on. Mechanism 2. Status. Ambiguity. Here is something the human brain does automatically in every single interaction you have ever had. It calculates. Before you even consciously register what someone said, your brain is already running a quiet background process, measuring the other person, measuring their confidence, measuring their emotional stability, measuring how much their words seem to cost them. And based on all of that, your brain assigns them a position: high, low, equal. This happens in 2 seconds, maybe less. Now, here's the dangerous part. Most people reveal their position without knowing it. When someone insults you and you immediately fire back, you have just told that person's brain, "Your words reached me. You have access to my emotional state." When you rush to defend yourself against a criticism, you have just confirmed your opinion carries weight in my world. Every reactive response is a status signal, and most of the time, it is a signal that drops you below the person who provoked you. But silence, genuine, unrushed, unbothered silence, does something completely different. It creates what psychologists call status. Ambiguity. The hierarchy becomes unclear, and this is psychologically unbearable for most people. Because, as Carl Jung wrote, the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. The key word there is reaction. When there is no reaction, when one personality refuses to be transformed by the contact, the other person is left, holding the entire chemical reaction alone. They expected an exchange. They expected a collision. Instead, they encounter something that will not be moved. And the mind asks immediately, why won't it move? What does this person know that I don't? Nietzsche understood this deeply. He wrote, "The higher we soar, the smaller we appear to those who cannot fly." When you refuse to engage at the levels someone is trying to pull you down to, when you stay above the emotional turbulence without announcing it, you don't look weak. You look elevated, and people cannot easily dominate someone whose position they cannot clearly read. This is why the most powerful people in any room are rarely the loudest ones. They are the ones whose level you cannot quite determine. They are the ones who seem to exist slightly outside the normal social scramble. Their silence is not empty. It is full of something people cannot name. And what people cannot name, they respect, or they fear. Often both. Mechanism 3. The invisible wall. Now we go one level deeper. Mechanisms 1 and 2 explain what silence does to a person's perception of you. Mechanism 3 explains what it does to their behavior. When you consistently refuse to react, not once, not twice, but as a pattern, you build something around yourself that other people can feel but cannot see. A wall. Not a wall made of coldness. Not a wall made of arrogance. A wall made of psychological consistency. Sigmund Freud spent decades studying what happens when people encounter consistent non-response to their emotional bids. What he found was striking. He observed that when a person repeatedly fails to get an emotional response from someone they are targeting, they do not simply stop. First, they escalate. They try harder. They speak louder. They use sharper words. They push in ways they were not planning to push, because the absence of reaction triggers something almost primal, a deep need to confirm that they exist inside your mind. And here is the extraordinary thing. Every single escalation makes them more visible. Every attempt to break through your wall exposes more of their need, more of their anxiety, more of the insecurity that was driving the provocation in the first place. You don't have to say a single word about them. You don't have to call them out, expose them, or argue your case. Their own escalation does it for you. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor who governed one of the most powerful empires in human history, wrote this in his private journal, a book we now call Meditations. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. But there is a second layer to that sentence that people miss. When you have power over your mind, when outside events genuinely cannot move you, the people who are trying to move you start to look frantic, unhinged, unstable. Not because you made them that way, because your stillness held up a mirror, a real mirror this time, and forced them to see their own behavior clearly. The invisible wall is not built in one moment. It is built through repetition, through every time you chose stillness when reaction would have been easier, through every time you let a provocation dissolve into silence instead of answering it. And over time, slowly, quietly, people stop throwing rocks at it, not because you asked them to, because they got tired of watching their rocks fall. We are now halfway through the 7 mechanisms. And I need you to stay with me, because what comes next is the one most people never see coming. Mechanism 4 is about time, and how silence weaponizes it. There is a story that historians still talk about. In the winter of 1944, during one of the most brutal periods of the Second World War, General Dwight Eisenhower received a message from a German commander demanding the immediate surrender of American forces at Bast. The American general at the scene, a man named Anthony McAuliffe, read the message. He thought about it, and then he wrote back a single word: nuts. That was the entire reply. The German commanders were confused, then frustrated, then furious. They spent hours trying to decode what the word meant, whether it was a military term, a coded message, a sign of defeat or defiance. Meanwhile, McAuliffe's forces held their position. The confusion McAuliffe created with that single "Bizarre non answer" bought his troops critical time. It disrupted German planning. It planted doubt where there had been certainty. One word, an almost meaningless word, and the psychological balance of an entire confrontation shifted, because his enemies could not close the loop. And an open loop does something very specific to the human mind. Mechanism for delayed psychological gravity. In the 1920s, a Soviet psychologist named Zeigarnik noticed something strange about waiters in a cafe. The waiters could remember every detail of an order that had not yet been delivered, every item, every special request, every table number. But the moment the food was delivered and the order was complete, they forgot everything almost instantly. The incomplete task lived in their mind. The complete task was released. This became known as the Zeigarnik Effect, the psychological phenomenon where unfinished business occupies far more mental space than finished business. And this is exactly what strategic silence does to someone who tried to provoke you. When you react immediately, when you argue back, defend yourself, explain your position, you give them closure, the loop closes. Their brain files a moment away and moves on. But when you say nothing, the loop stays open. Their brain keeps returning to it, turning it over, searching for an explanation. Why didn't they react? What does that silence mean? Did they not hear me? Did they not care? Or did they hear me and simply decide I wasn't worth their energy? That last possibility, I wasn't worth. Their NAG is the one that does the most damage. Because most provocations come from a place of needing to feel significant, needing to feel like they affected you, needing to confirm that they exist inside your mental world, and your silence tells them quietly, without cruelty, without confrontation, that they do not. Carl Jung wrote, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself." The person who provoked you and got no response is experiencing a very particular kind of loneliness. The loneliness of having spoken into a space where their words did not land. And that feeling does not go away quickly. It pulls at them, like gravity pulling a falling object. Slowly at first, then heavier and heavier the longer it goes unresolved. Schopenhauer wrote that the greatest of follies is to sacrifice health, money, and leisure in the chase of worldly happiness. But there is a parallel truth in social dynamics. The greatest strategic mistake is to give away your peace in the chase of winning a small argument. Your silence costs you nothing. Their obsession with your silence costs them everything. Meanwhile, you have moved on. You are present in the next moment, the next room, the next conversation. The gravity is pulling at them, not at you. Mechanism 5. Provocation exposure. This mechanism is the one that changes how other people see the situation. Here is what most people do not realize. When someone provokes you in a social setting at work, at a family gathering, online, anywhere with observers, they are counting on something very specific happening next. They are counting on your reaction to shift the focus. As long as you are reacting, arguing, defending, explaining, pushing back, all eyes are on the argument. All eyes are on the exchange. No one is clearly the aggressor, and no one is clearly composed. The situation looks messy, and messy situations make it very hard to judge who actually started it. But the moment you go quiet, the focus shifts back. Now all eyes are on the person who is still pushing, and they are pushing against nothing. They begin to look increasingly out of proportion, increasingly emotional, increasingly desperate for a reaction that is no longer available. Plato wrote in the Republic that the measure of a man is what he does with power. But there is an equally true inverse. The measure of a person is what they do when their power fails to produce a reaction. And most people, when their provocation fails, they do not gracefully withdraw. They escalate. They repeat themselves. They sharpen the criticism. They add sarcasm or public humiliation, and every single step of that escalation is visible. Every step builds a clearer picture, not of you, but of them. Their intention, their insecurity, their need to see you react. Robert Greene wrote in The Laws of Human Nature, the ability to observe without reacting is the master skill. That is exactly what provocation exposure is. By doing nothing, by being the calm, still presence in the middle of someone else's escalating storm, you allow their behavior to become the story. You don't need to write the narrative. You just need to refuse to interrupt it. We are going into the final two mechanisms now, and these are the ones that go deepest. The ones about authority, and about who actually owns the interaction from the very beginning. Stay with me. 27 years. That is how long Nelson Mandela spent in prison. 27 years of isolation, physical labor, and deliberate psychological pressure designed to break him. The South African government tried everything. They offered him release repeatedly on the condition that he publicly denounce armed resistance. He refused every time. Silently. Without theater. Without angry speeches made from inside a cell. When he finally walked out free in 1990, journalists expected to see rage. They expected bitterness. They expected the kind of volcanic reaction that would have been completely understandable, even justified from a man who had been treated the way he had been treated. Instead, they saw something that disturbed them in a completely different way. They saw a man who appeared completely unbroken, not pretending to be okay, and that inexplicable emotional immunity was what made him terrifying to his former captors and magnetic to the entire world simultaneously. Because a person who cannot be broken by 27 years of imprisonment cannot be broken by anything you throw at them in a conversation. Mechanism seeks authority through emotional immunity. We talk about authority as though it comes from title, status, money, or volume. But watch what actually happens in real human interactions. When a manager loses their temper in a meeting, their authority does not increase, it drops. Everyone in the room quietly recalibrates. They can be shaken. They are not as strong as we thought. When a public figure responds with visible anger to every criticism, they do not appear more powerful, they appear more fragile. Every reaction confirms that the criticism found its mark. Authority, real psychological authority, comes from one thing: the visible proof that you cannot be easily moved. Carl Jung called this individuation, the process by which a person becomes so deeply rooted in their own identity that external pressure simply cannot penetrate the center. He wrote, "Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." The person who is awake, who knows themselves completely, who has done the deep work of understanding their own reactions and their own patterns, that person is extraordinarily difficult to provoke, because you cannot destabilize something that knows exactly where it stands. Epictetus wrote, "Seek not the good in external things, seek it in yourself." What he means in the language of psychological power is this: the person who needs external validation is permanently vulnerable to anyone who threatens to withhold it. But the person who carries their own sense of value, who does not require your reaction to feel secure, that person is invulnerable in the deepest possible sense. And invulnerable people are not just difficult to provoke. They are magnetic. Because every human being at some level is searching for stability, for someone who will not crack under pressure, for someone they can orient themselves around when the environment becomes chaotic. The person who remains emotionally immune does not need to announce their authority. People feel Italiano, and they organize themselves around it automatically. The same way ion filings organize around a magnet, not because the magnet demanded it, but simply because of what it is. Jordan Peterson observed this in his clinical practice. He noted that the patients who made the fastest progress were not the ones who tried the hardest to change their circumstances. They were the ones who first developed the ability to tolerate uncertainty without collapsing, to sit inside discomfort without immediately trying to escape it. That tolerance, that emotional immunity, changed how the world responded to them, without them changing anything external at all. Mechanism 7, the silence reversal. We arrive now at the final mechanism, and it is the one that ties every other mechanism together. Here is what is actually happening at the very beginning of every provocation. Someone decides, consciously or unconsciously, that they want to control an interaction. They introduce tension. They say something designed to pull you into a specific emotional space, and in that first moment, they believe they are steering. They believe the interaction belongs to them. But here's the truth that Machiavelli understood better than almost anyone who has ever written about power. Whoever controls their response controls the frame, and whoever controls the frame controls the outcome. When you react, when you step inside the emotional structure they created, you have accepted their frame. You are now playing inside their game, by their rules, on terrain they chose. But when you go silent, you step outside the frame entirely, and the moment you do that, something remarkable begins. The person who thought they were controlling the interaction is now waiting. They expected movement. They expected engagement. Instead, they are standing in the middle of a game that only one person is playing. And slowly, without you touching them, the weight of that situation begins to shift onto their shoulders. They start filling the silence, explaining themselves, repeating their point, changing their tone. Every adjustment they make is an unconscious acknowledgement that the frame they built is failing. Nietzsche wrote, "He who has a why to live can bear almost anyhow." The person with a strong internal center, a strong why, does not need external validation to feel stable. They can sit in silence indefinitely. They can let an interaction die without feeling the compulsion to resuscitate it. But the person whose provocation is driven by need, the need to feel significant, the need to feel powerful, they need to confirm their influence, that person cannot tolerate the silence. They will break it themselves, and in breaking it, they reveal everything. Freud identified this pattern as what he called the compulsion to repeat, the tendency to keep returning to unresolved emotional experiences in search of a different outcome. When you refuse to give someone the reaction they expected, You create an unresolved experience, and they will keep circling back to it in the same conversation, in the next interaction, in the way they think about you when you're not in the room. Meanwhile, you have moved on. The silence reversal is complete. What began as their attempt to control you has become their own private obsession. Their need for your reaction has made them the reactive one. And you who said nothing have become the most powerful presence in the interaction. Here is what all 7 mechanisms have in common. None of them require aggression. None of them require you to be cruel, cold, or deliberately hurtful. They require only one thing: the ability to choose whether you react, to choose whether you give someone access to your emotional state, to choose whether an interaction deserves your energy. Because when you can truly choose, you are no longer being controlled. You become, in the words of Marcus Aurelius, like a rock against which the waves break constantly, but it stands firm and tames the fury of the water around it. That rock does not fight the waves. It does not argue with them. It simply refuses to move, and the waves eventually always exhaust themselves. If this video shifted something in the way you see social dynamics, share it with one person who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to The Aware Mind, because on this channel, we do not talk about surface-level motivation. We go underneath the surface. We go into the architecture of power, perception, and the human mind. And if you want to know which of these 7 mechanisms is the hardest one to master and how to actually build it in real life, that is the next video. I will see you there.